The moment she texted me flight delayed, I was already watching her board. I didn't move. I didn't call. I didn't even blink. The glass wall in front of me reflected a man I barely recognized, calm, steady, standing still while his entire life quietly shifted out of place. Olivia Walker stood 20 yards away at gate C-17, her back half-turned, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her carry-on. The same navy suitcase I bought her last Christmas. The one she said she'd only use for work trips. The overhead lights washed everything in that sterile airport glow, bright enough to see everything, cold enough to make it all feel unreal. Around her, people moved in predictable patterns, families juggling backpacks, business travelers glued to their phones, the occasional announcement echoing through the terminal, but she stood still, focused, waiting. Not for a delayed flight. For him. My phone buzzed again in my hand. Boarding's pushed back another hour. I'll call you when I land. The message sat there, clean and simple, like it belonged to a different reality. I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Completely. Then I lifted my eyes back to the gate. That's when he stepped into frame. Tall. Confident. The kind of man who moved like he never questioned where he belonged. He walked straight up to her, no hesitation, no distance, like this wasn't new. Like this wasn't something they were trying to hide. Olivia smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile she used at dinners or family events. This one was softer. Familiar. Real. She reached out, adjusted something on his jacket, her fingers lingering just a second too long for it to mean nothing. He said something I couldn't hear. She laughed quietly. And just like that, every excuse I had ever made for her collapsed. I didn't feel rage. Not yet. It was something colder. Quieter. Like a realization settling into place piece by piece. Because the truth is, I wasn't surprised. Not really. You don't go from everything being perfect to something like this overnight. It doesn't work that way. There are signs. Small ones at first. Easy to ignore. Late-night texts that stop when you walk in the room. Trips that get scheduled last minute. Conversations that feel just slightly off. I noticed them. Of course I did. I just chose not to name them. Because naming something makes it real. And real things don't go away just because you want them to. Another announcement echoed overhead. Group B now boarding. People started lining up. Olivia stepped forward with them. He stayed close beside her. Not touching this time. But not needing to. That kind of distance, it says more than proximity ever could. I shifted slightly, just enough to keep them in view without drawing attention. Years of business travel taught me how to disappear in places like this. How to watch without being seen. It's a useful skill. More useful than I ever expected it to be. My phone screen dimmed in my hand, her message still open. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been answered right in front of me. As the line moved forward, she handed over her boarding pass. The agent scanned it with a soft beep. Routine. Ordinary. Like everything else in this moment that wasn't supposed to exist. Then she stepped through. He followed right behind her. Same flight. Same destination. No delay. No confusion. Just clarity. Clean and undeniable. I exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when something finally clicks into place after weeks of not quite fitting right. The gate area emptied out. The noise faded. And I just stood there for a second longer, staring at the space where she had been, letting the silence do what it does best, fill in all the gaps you were too busy ignoring before. Because here's the part that matters. The part most people get wrong. Catching her, that wasn't the moment everything broke. It was the moment everything made sense. Airports have a rhythm once you stop rushing through them. Announcements repeat, footsteps echo, screens flicker with departures that mean everything to someone and nothing to everyone else. I stayed where I was for a moment, letting that rhythm settle around me, letting my pulse match it. Calm. Measured. Controlled. That was always my advantage. I did not chase problems. I studied them. I stepped away from the gate. Slowly, blending into the stream of travelers heading toward the central concourse. No one noticed me. No one ever does when you move like you belong. My phone buzzed again in my hand. Another message from Olivia. Signal is bad here. Talk later. I looked at the words, then locked the screen without replying. She was already in the air, or close to it, sitting next to a man she never mentioned, heading to a destination she had already lied about. And yet the lie itself was not what mattered anymore. Lies are just surface noise. What matters is the pattern underneath. And I had been watching that pattern longer than she realized. This was not the first time something did not add up. It was just the first time I chose to see it all the way through. I walked past the coffee stand, the smell of burned espresso hanging heavy in the air, and found an empty seat near a charging station. I sat down, placed my carry-on beside me, and finally let myself replay what I had just seen. Not emotionally. Not yet. Just fact by fact. She arrived early. No hesitation. No confusion. She knew exactly where she was going. He arrived separately, but not like a stranger. They did not greet each other like co-workers. There was no distance, no formality. Familiarity like that does not happen overnight. It builds. Quietly. Repeatedly. Over time. I opened my phone again, not to read her messages, but to check something else. The airline application loaded in seconds. Years of travel had me organized in ways most people never think about. Shared accounts. Linked rewards. Overlapping itineraries. Small conveniences that make life easier when you trust the person you share them with. I scrolled through the recent activity, my thumb moving steady, deliberate. And there it was. Her booking. Same flight number I had just watched depart. Same destination she had claimed was delayed. No delay. No change. Just confirmation. I stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary, not because I needed proof anymore, but because seeing it written out made it impossible to soften the edges. It was clean. Precise. Undeniable. I leaned back in the chair, exhaled slowly, and let a different kind of thought settle in. This was not a mistake. Not a one-time lapse. This was a system. Trips scheduled in advance. Stories prepared ahead of time. Timing coordinated down to the minute. People do not build systems like that unless they plan to use them more than once. Around me, a family argued quietly over boarding zones, a businessman laughed too loudly into his headset, a child dragged a stuffed animal across the floor. Life continued exactly as it always does, indifferent to the moment that just redefined mine. I watched it all without really seeing any of it. Because my focus had shifted. Before, I was trying to understand what was happening. Now, I was thinking about what it meant. And more importantly, what came next. Most people think the moment you catch something like this is when you react. You confront. You demand answers. You force the truth into the open. But that only works if you need closure. I did not. I already had something better than closure. I had clarity. And clarity is quiet. It does not rush. It does not panic. It waits. I pulled out my laptop, set it on the small table in front of me, and opened it without hesitation. If there is one thing I have learned in my line of work, it is this. When something does not make sense, you do not ask questions first. You gather information. You build a timeline. You connect the pieces until the picture explains itself. Then, and only then, do you decide what to do with it. I connected to the airport network, the screen glowing faintly in the artificial light, and began pulling up everything I had ignored for weeks. Emails. Calendar entries. Travel confirmations. Small details that meant nothing on their own, but together would tell a story far more honest than anything she would ever say. Because whatever this was, however long it had been happening, one thing was already clear. This was not the beginning. It was just the first time I chose not to look away. I have always believed that patterns tell the truth long before people do. You just have to be willing to sit still long enough to see them form. The airport noise faded into something distant as my screen filled with timestamps and confirmations. Each one small on its own, but together building something far more precise than any explanation she could give me. I started with the last 3 months. That was enough. It always is. You do not need years to understand a lie, you just need the right window. Her calendar looked normal at first glance. Meetings, client dinners, conferences in cities I knew well enough to picture without thinking. Chicago, Denver, Miami. The kind of travel that makes sense when you work in marketing. The kind of travel I never questioned because it mirrored my own. But then I started layering it. Her bookings against mine. Her flights against the ones she told me about. Small discrepancies at first. Departure times that did not match the stories. Return flights that landed earlier than she claimed. Gaps. Always gaps. And gaps are where truth lives. I opened another tab and pulled up the shared mileage account. We set that up years ago, when everything between us was still simple. Earn points together. Use them for vacations. It felt like a small version of building a life. Now it felt like an archive. Every flight logged. Every seat assigned. Every mile recorded without emotion. I scrolled slowly, my eyes tracking numbers instead of feelings. Because numbers do not lie. They do not hesitate. They do not change their story depending on who is asking. And what I saw was not random. It was consistent. The same flight numbers repeating. The same destinations cycling back every few weeks. And then something even more specific. The same companion booking pattern. Not linked directly, not in a way that would be obvious, but close enough in timing and seat class that it did not take much to connect. 2 people traveling separately on paper, but always ending up on the same plane. Always within rows of each other. Always returning within minutes. That is not coincidence. That is coordination. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, the glow of the screen reflecting off the polished surface beneath it. Around me, the world kept moving, but I had stepped outside of it. This was different now. This was not about what I saw at the gate anymore. That moment was just confirmation. What I was looking at now was structure. A system built carefully enough to avoid obvious detection, but not careful enough to withstand real attention. And the longer I looked, the clearer it became. 6 months. That was the timeline. 6 months of overlapping flights. 6 months of adjusted stories. 6 months of a life running parallel to the one I thought I was part of. I did not feel anger. Not yet. Anger requires surprise, and surprise had already passed. What I felt instead was something sharper. Focus. The kind of focus that narrows everything down to what matters and removes everything that does not. I opened her email next. Not to read conversations. That would come later. For now, I was interested in confirmations. Receipts. Automated messages that people forget about because they feel insignificant. Except they are not. They are the backbone of every plan. And there it was again. Hotel bookings that did not match the conference locations she mentioned. Check-in times that lined up perfectly with the flights I had just traced. 2 nights here. 3 nights there. Always just long enough to justify the trip. Never long enough to raise suspicion. If you are not looking. I sat back again, letting the chair take my weight, and stared at the screen without scrolling. Because at a certain point you stop searching for proof. You recognize that you already have it. The rest is just repetition. And repetition is not necessary when the pattern is clear. Daniel Brooks. The name surfaced quietly in my mind, not from the screen, but from memory. She mentioned him once. Maybe twice. A former colleague. Someone who moved to a different branch. It sounded unimportant at the time. Background noise. The kind of detail you hear and immediately let go. But now it fit. Too well. I did not need a message thread to confirm it. Not yet. The structure already told me enough. The man at the gate was not a stranger. He was part of something ongoing. Something organized. Something that had been happening right in front of me, just out of focus. I closed the laptop slowly, not because I was done, but because I had reached the point where information turns into decision. And decisions should never be rushed. Not when they matter. Especially not when they matter. I picked up my phone again, her last message still sitting there, untouched, like a question waiting for an answer it would never receive. I looked at it for a moment, then locked the screen again. Because responding would mean stepping back into a version of reality that no longer existed. And I was not interested in that anymore. What mattered now was simple. I knew. Not part of it. Not pieces of it. All of it. And once you know something like that, the only question left is not what happened. It is what you are going to do about it. People think distance creates problems in a marriage, but that is not entirely true. Distance does not break things. It reveals what was already starting to shift. Looking back now, the signs were not hidden. They were just quiet. And quiet things are easy to ignore when your life is moving fast enough. 8 years of marriage does not collapse in a single moment at an airport gate. It unravels slowly, thread by thread, long before anyone notices the fabric is coming apart. I met Olivia when everything in my life was still building upward. I was 31, traveling constantly, chasing contracts across different states, measuring success in miles flown and deals closed. She was sharp, confident, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make it feel like she belonged there before anyone even spoke to her. We fit together easily at the start. That is how these things always begin. Easy conversations. Shared plans. The sense that you are both moving in the same direction, even if the paths look different. When we got married, we told ourselves we understood what my work required. Long stretches away. Late nights. Flights booked with little notice. It was not ideal, but it was manageable. Or at least, that is what we believed. The first few years felt stable. Predictable in a good way. Sunday mornings with coffee on the patio when I was home. Short trips planned around my schedule. The kind of routine that feels like progress because nothing is falling apart. But stability can be misleading. It can look like strength when it is really just silence filling the space where something should be growing. I remember the first time something felt slightly off. It was small enough that I almost dismissed it immediately. A conversation that ended too quickly. A smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The kind of moment you notice but cannot explain, so you file it away as nothing. Then it happened again. Not the same situation, but the same feeling. A slight delay before answering a simple question. A shift in tone that did not match the words being said. Still nothing concrete. Nothing you could point to and say, this is the problem. Just a pattern beginning to form at the edges. My schedule did not help. Weeks at a time on the road, moving from one city to the next, living out of hotels that all start to feel the same after a while. You tell yourself that providing stability is enough. That showing up when you can balances out the times when you cannot. And for a while, that belief holds. It gives you a reason not to question the things that do not quite fit. Olivia adapted well on the surface. She built her own routine. Work events. Networking dinners. Weekend plans with friends I only met a handful of times. She became more independent, which I told myself was a good thing. Healthy even. But independence can shift into distance without warning. And distance, once it settles in, does not announce itself. It just becomes normal. There were moments I look back on now that feel different in hindsight. Nights when she said she was too tired to talk, but her energy returned the second her phone lit up. Trips that extended by a day or two with explanations that sounded reasonable enough at the time. A gradual change in how often she asked about my day, replaced by shorter, more efficient conversations that felt more like updates than connection. None of it was dramatic. That is the part most people misunderstand. There was no single argument. No explosion. Just a slow shift from something that felt shared to something that felt separate. And when things change that gradually, you adjust without realizing it. You lower expectations. You accept silence where there used to be conversation. You stop asking certain questions because the answers feel less important than maintaining the version of stability you think you still have. I did that. I let small things pass because they did not seem big enough to challenge. I told myself that every marriage goes through phases. That this was temporary. That once work slowed down, once schedules aligned again, everything would settle back into place. But now, sitting there with everything laid out in front of me, I could see it clearly. Those were not random moments. They were early signs of something already in motion. The beginning of a shift I chose not to follow all the way through. And that is the thing about clarity. It does not just show you what is happening now. It forces you to reevaluate everything that came before. Every detail. Every assumption. Every time you chose comfort over curiosity. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand where it started, you realize this was never about a single flight, or a single lie. It was about a timeline that began long before I ever stood in that airport, watching something I should have recognized months ago. The hardest part about seeing the truth is not the moment it happens. It is everything that follows when your mind starts replaying the past with new eyes. Once the pattern becomes clear, every small detail you once ignored begins to resurface, sharper, louder, impossible to dismiss. I stayed at the airport longer than I needed to, not because I had somewhere to go, but because leaving would have meant stepping back into a version of my life that no longer fit. Instead, I sat there and let the timeline rebuild itself in my head, piece by piece, moment by moment, until it stopped being abstract and started becoming specific. There was a business trip to Denver about 5 months ago. I remembered it because my flight got canceled due to weather, and I had to rebook at the last minute. I called Olivia that night from the hotel, expecting the usual conversation, something normal to anchor the day. She answered, but something felt off. Not in a dramatic way. Just distant. Her voice was there, but her attention was not. I asked what she was doing, and she said she was out with coworkers, something casual, nothing worth mentioning. At the time, I accepted it without question. Now, sitting there with everything aligned, I pulled up that date again. Same pattern. Same flight pairing. Same city. She was not just out with coworkers. She was in the same place I was. On the same night. And I never knew. That realization did not hit like a shock. It settled slowly, like a weight finding its place. Another memory followed. A weekend she extended a trip to Miami, saying her client needed extra time. I remember being mildly annoyed, not because of suspicion, but because we had planned something small when she got back. Dinner, nothing elaborate. She apologized, said she would make it up to me, and I told her it was fine. Because it always felt easier to say it was fine. Now I could see it differently. That extension was not last minute. It was scheduled. Coordinated. Planned with the same precision as everything else I had just uncovered. There were more moments. Dozens of them. Small shifts in behavior that never quite added up on their own. The way she started guarding her phone more carefully, angling the screen away without making it obvious. The way her travel details became less specific over time, more generalized, as if precision would create risk. The subtle change in how she spoke about her work, less about people, more about vague outcomes. All of it designed to reduce the chance of contradiction. And it worked. Because I was not looking for contradictions. I was looking for consistency, for reassurance, for something that told me everything was still intact. That is the mistake. You do not find truth when you are only looking for comfort. You find it when you are willing to question the things that feel slightly wrong. I had not been willing. Not until now. I picked up my phone again, not to check her messages, but to scroll through our past conversations. Weeks of text threads filled with normal exchanges. Updates about flights. Quick check-ins. Small jokes that felt routine at the time. And woven through all of it were the same phrases repeated in different forms. Running. Late. Change of plans. flight issues. Each one believable on its own. Together, they formed something else entirely. A script. I realized then that what I had seen at the airport was not the betrayal itself. It was just the first moment where the script broke down. Where the performance and the reality overlapped long enough for me to see both at the same time. And once you see that, you cannot go back to just hearing the lines. You start listening for what is missing. For what does not align. For what has been carefully left out. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This was not impulsive. It was not reckless. It was controlled. Measured. Built over time with enough attention to detail that it could exist undetected for months. That level of consistency requires intention. And intention changes everything. It means this was not about a moment of weakness. It was about a choice repeated again and again until it became routine. I sat there, the noise of the airport blending into the background again, and let that idea settle fully. Because understanding the nature of the problem is the only way to respond to it correctly. If this had been random, emotional, unplanned, the solution would look one way. But it was not. It was structured. And structured problems require structured responses. I did not feel the need to confront her. Not yet. Confrontation without preparation only gives the other person a chance to adjust their story. And Olivia was already very good at adjusting her story. What I needed now was something else entirely. Not answers. Not explanations. Evidence. Clear. Complete. Undeniable. Because the moment I chose to act, I was not going to rely on what she said. I was going to rely on what could not be changed. And for the first time since I walked into that airport, I felt something settle into place that was not confusion, not doubt, not even anger. It was direction. Quiet. Focused. Certain. Because now I was no longer reacting to what I had seen. I was preparing for what I was going to do next. I did not leave the airport with answers. I left with a plan. There is a difference, and most people never learn it until it is too late. Answers satisfy curiosity. Plans change outcomes. By the time I stepped outside into the parking structure, the air cooler, quieter, stripped of the artificial brightness inside, I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Not emotionally. Logically. That is the only way to handle something like this without losing control of it. I drove home without turning on the radio. No distractions. Just the steady hum of the engine and the repetition of everything I had already confirmed. Patterns. Timelines. Gaps filled in with precision. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Lights off. Still. Unchanged. That was the strange part. Everything on the outside remained intact, even when everything underneath it had already shifted. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and paused for a second in the entryway. Not because I hesitated, but because I understood something clearly in that moment. This space, this routine, this version of normal, it was no longer something I could assume was real. It was just a setting. And settings can be changed. I set my keys down, walked into the living room, and turned on a single lamp. Soft light filled the space, just enough to see without fully waking the house. I moved through it slowly, not searching for anything obvious, just observing. The couch. The coffee table. The framed photos on the wall. Smiles captured in moments that now felt incomplete. Not fake. Just incomplete. Because they did not include what was happening in parallel. I walked into the bedroom next. Her side of the closet was organized the same way it always had been. Dresses spaced evenly. Shoes lined up below. Everything in place. Order. That was consistent with everything else I had seen. Olivia did not operate in chaos. She operated in control. That meant whatever I was about to uncover next would not be careless. It would be hidden just well enough to avoid casual detection. Which meant I would have to be intentional. I sat down at the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone, not to check messages, but to begin something more deliberate. Documentation. The first step is always to preserve what you already know. I opened a secure folder and started organizing everything I had seen so far. Flight records, booking confirmations, screenshots of timelines that align too perfectly to be coincidence. Each file labeled clearly. Each detail placed where it could be referenced later without confusion. Because memory is unreliable under pressure. Evidence is not. Once that was done, I moved to the next layer. Access. Not invasive. Not reckless. Just observant. I knew her habits. The times she checked certain accounts. The devices she trusted. The routines she followed without thinking about them. That kind of familiarity does not disappear just because the relationship changes. It becomes an advantage. I powered on her tablet from the nightstand. She rarely used it, which made it useful. Less monitored. Less secured. The screen lit up without resistance. No password prompt. No hesitation. Exactly as expected. I navigated through it slowly, not opening anything unnecessary, just mapping what was there. Emails synced. Calendar mirrored. Travel confirmations stored automatically. Small conveniences that made her life easier. And now made mine clearer. I did not rush. That is the mistake people make when they feel urgency. They move too fast, miss details, alert the very thing they are trying to understand. I did the opposite. I moved carefully, methodically, taking note of what mattered and ignoring what did not. Then I saw it. Not a message. Not a conversation. Something simpler. A contact entry. Daniel Brooks. The name again. This time not from memory, but from something tangible. Saved without a company tag. No last interaction visible on the surface. Clean. Minimal. Almost like it was meant to look unimportant. But people do not save contacts they do not use. And they definitely do not keep them this clean unless they are aware of how it might look to someone else. I did not open it. Not yet. That was not necessary. The existence of it, combined with everything else, was enough for now. Confirmation without confrontation. That is how you build something solid. I set the tablet back exactly where I found it, the screen dimming as if nothing had been touched. Then I stood up and looked around the room one more time. Same furniture. Same layout. Same silence. But everything meant something different now. Because I was no longer living inside it blindly. I was observing it from the outside, piece by piece, understanding how it functioned and where it broke. And that changed everything. I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall back into darkness, and walked out without hesitation. Because at this point, there was no doubt left. No confusion. No questions that needed immediate answers. There was only one thing left to do. Build the full picture. And then decide exactly how I wanted it to end. By the next morning, nothing looked different. That was the most deceptive part of it all. The sunlight came through the same kitchen window, casting the same soft lines across the countertop. The coffee machine hummed the same way it always did. Everything moved forward exactly as it had the day before, as if nothing underneath it had changed. But I knew better. Because once you see the structure behind something, you stop trusting the surface. I kept my routine intact. That was important. Disruption creates attention, and attention leads to questions. I did not want questions. Not yet. I poured coffee, checked emails, responded to work messages with the same tone I always used. Controlled. Efficient. Normal. If anyone had seen me in that moment, they would have seen the same man they always had. And that was the point. Around 10 in the morning, my phone buzzed again. Her name lit up the screen. Olivia. I let it ring once, twice, then answered on the third. Not too fast. Not too slow. Hey, I said, steady neutral. Her voice came through clear, relaxed, exactly how it always sounded when she believed everything was under control. Hey, sorry about last night. The delay turned into a mess. I just landed. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting a small pause sit between us. Not long enough to feel strange. Just enough to register. That bad? I asked. Simple. Open. She exhaled lightly, the sound of movement in the background, probably the airport terminal. Yeah, they kept pushing it. You know how it goes. I did not even sleep. I nodded, even though she could not see it. The script continued exactly as expected. No hesitation. No cracks. Just a clean delivery of something she had likely said before in different forms. Long trip, I replied. Where are you now? There was a brief pause. Not enough for most people to notice. But I noticed. Because now I was listening differently. Still at the airport, she said. Waiting on my ride. Not specific. Not detailed. Just enough to satisfy a casual question. I let the silence stretch for half a second before responding. Got it. Get some rest when you can. No confrontation. No pressure. Nothing that would force her to adjust the narrative. That was the key. You do not challenge a story while it is still being told. You let it finish. I will, she said, her tone softening slightly. I will call you later, okay? Sounds good, I answered. Then I ended the call first. Another small detail. Control does not always come from what you say. Sometimes it comes from when you choose to stop listening. I set the phone down and stared at it for a moment, not thinking about her words, but about how easily they came. That level of consistency takes practice. It takes repetition. Which meant this was not new for her. It was familiar. Routine. And that confirms something important. I was not dealing with uncertainty anymore. I was dealing with something established. Something she believed she could maintain indefinitely. That belief would be her weakness. Because systems that rely on control only work as long as no one disrupts the pattern. And I was about to disrupt it. But not directly. Not emotionally. Strategically. I opened my laptop again and added a new layer to what I had already built. Call logs. Message timestamps. Cross-referenced with flight data. Every interaction placed against a real-world event. Not to prove she was lying. I already knew that. This was about precision. About building something that could not be dismissed, reinterpreted, or explained away. Because when the time came, I was not going to argue. I was going to present. And there is a difference. Arguments invite denial. Presentation leaves no space for it. Hours passed without me noticing. Each detail fitting into place, each connection reinforcing the same conclusion. By early afternoon, I had something solid. Not complete yet, but strong enough to stand on its own. Strong enough to support what came next. I closed the laptop and leaned back, letting the quiet of the room settle around me again. This was the turning point. Not the airport. Not the discovery. This moment right here. Because this was where reaction ended and intention began. Most people think revenge starts with anger. It does not. It starts with clarity. With understanding exactly what happened, how it happened, and what outcome you want to create. Without that, everything else is just noise. And I was not interested in noise. I was interested in results. I picked up my phone one more time, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped on a name I had not needed in years. A legal contact. Someone who specialized in situations where information mattered more than emotion. I did not call. Not yet. Timing matters. Everything has a sequence. And I was not going to move out of order. Instead, I locked the phone, set it down, and stood up slowly. Because now I understood something with absolute certainty. This was no longer about catching her. That part was already done. This was about what I was going to build with what I knew. And once that was complete, there would be no going back. Not for her. Not for me. Not for anything that came after. By late afternoon, the plan stopped being an idea and started becoming a structure. There is a point where gathering information is no longer enough, where you have to decide how that information will be used. That is where most people hesitate. They sit with what they know, waiting for clarity to turn into courage. I did not wait. I moved. Not loudly. Not recklessly. Just deliberately. The first call I made was not emotional. It was precise. I stepped outside, away from the house, away from anything that could blur the line between personal and strategic, and dialed the number I had already selected hours earlier. He answered on the second ring. Calm. Professional. The kind of voice that does not react to situations, only evaluates them. "This is Ethan Walker," I said. No explanation. No hesitation. "I need to discuss a situation that requires discretion." There was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. "Understood," he replied. "Do you have documentation?" I looked back at the house for a brief second, then away again. "Enough to start." That was all he needed. We set a time. Early the next morning. Private office. No digital trail beyond what was necessary. Clean. Controlled. Exactly how it should be. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, letting the silence settle again. That was step one. Not confrontation. Not exposure. Positioning. Because once you involve someone who operates within structure, everything changes. It is no longer about emotion. It is about outcome. I went back inside and continued building. Not randomly. Not all at once. Layer by layer. Financial records came next. Joint accounts. Individual accounts. Transfers that made sense on the surface but revealed more when aligned with travel timelines. Nothing dramatic. That is the thing most people misunderstand. It is rarely dramatic. It is subtle. Incremental. Adjustments made over time so they never feel like a shift. But when you map them correctly, the pattern becomes clear. Expenses that did not match stated trips. Charges in locations that were never mentioned. Small details, but consistent ones. And consistency is what turns suspicion into certainty. I documented everything. Dates. Locations. Amounts. Cross-referenced with flights and hotel stays. By the time I was done, it was no longer a loose collection of information. It was a system. One that could be followed from start to finish without gaps. One that told the story without needing interpretation. That is the goal. Not to argue. Not to convince. To present something that stands on its own. As evening approached, I shifted to the next phase. Control of exposure. I did not want surprises. Not from her. Not from him. Not from anyone connected to what was happening. I adjusted small things. Nothing obvious. Just enough to ensure that when the time came, I would not be reacting to new information. I would be operating from a position of certainty. I backed up every file to multiple locations. Physical and digital. Redundancy matters when information becomes leverage. I reviewed access points again. Accounts. Devices. Anything that could be altered or erased if she sensed a shift. Then I secured what needed to be secured. Quietly. Without leaving traces that could be noticed. By the time the sun went down, the house felt different. Not because anything had physically changed, but because I understood it differently. Every object, every routine, every silence carried context now. It was no longer just a place I lived. It was a space I was navigating with intention. My phone lit up once more. A message from Olivia. Finally heading home tomorrow. Miss you. I looked at the words for a moment, not with anger, not even with disbelief. Just observation. Because now I could see exactly where that message fit within the pattern. It was not spontaneous. It was part of the system. A reinforcement. A way to maintain balance between two realities. I did not respond right away. Timing matters. Even silence can be a tool if you understand how to use it. After a few minutes, I typed a simple reply. Safe travels. Nothing more. No questions. No emotion. Just enough to keep everything exactly where she believed it was. That is how you maintain control. You do not disrupt the illusion until you are ready to replace it with something else. I set the phone down and leaned back, letting the quiet stretch across the room. Tomorrow would move things forward. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But significantly. Because once the legal structure is in place, everything that follows becomes predictable. Documented. Enforceable. That is the difference between reacting and executing. And at this point, I was no longer reacting to anything. I was building something that would define exactly how this ends. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No tension in the air. No visible sign that anything had changed. That is how these moments work. The shift happens quietly, long before anyone else is aware of it. I got up at the same time, followed the same routine, moved through the same motions. Coffee. Emails. Silence. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. But I was no longer part of it in the same way. By 8:30, I was already on my way to the office we had agreed on. The building itself was unremarkable. Clean lines. Neutral colors. The kind of place designed for conversations that stay contained. I walked in without hesitation, checked in at the front desk, and was led down a quiet hallway to a conference room that felt intentionally simple. A table. 2 chairs. No distractions. He was already there when I entered. No introductions beyond what was necessary. No wasted words. That is how you know you are in the right place. I set my laptop on the table, opened it, and turned the screen toward him. This is the timeline, I said. Calm. Direct. He leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the structure I had built. Flights. Dates. Locations. Financial alignment. No gaps. No speculation. Just facts arranged in a way that spoke for themselves. He did not interrupt. He did not react. He simply followed the sequence from beginning to end, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking for clarification on a specific detail. Each question precise. Each answer supported. When he leaned back in his chair, there was no uncertainty in his expression. This is sufficient, he said. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just a statement of fact. And that was all I needed to hear. Because once something becomes sufficient, it becomes actionable. We moved through the next steps methodically. Asset protection. Documentation requirements. Legal positioning that would ensure everything unfolded exactly as intended when the time came. No surprises. No room for reinterpretation. Every piece aligned with the same principle. Control the outcome before the situation becomes visible. By the time the meeting ended, the framework was in place. Not the final move, but the structure that would support it. I left the building with the same steady pace I had walked in with. No rush. No hesitation. Because at this point, everything was already moving forward whether anyone else realized it or not. The rest of the day unfolded quietly. Work calls. Routine tasks. Normal conversations that carried no weight. Beyond their immediate purpose. I did not reach out to Olivia. I did not need to. The pattern would bring her back on its own. And right on schedule it did. Late afternoon, my phone lit up. A call this time. Not a message. I answered after a brief pause. Consistent. Controlled. Hey, she said, her voice softer than usual, like she was stepping back into something familiar. I am home. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, then opened them again. Good, I replied. How was the trip? A simple question. Neutral. She exhaled lightly. Long. I am exhausted. But I miss you. There it was again. The reinforcement. The line that keeps everything balanced. The part of the system designed to maintain the illusion. I listened without reacting, without challenging, without giving her anything that would shift the rhythm she believed was still intact. Get some rest, I said. We can talk later. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. Maybe she expected something else. Maybe she did not. It did not matter. Okay, she said. I will see you tonight. See you tonight, I repeated, then ended the call. I set the phone down and looked around the room, the same space that had not changed, the same walls, the same furniture. But now it felt different in a way that was difficult to explain unless you have lived through it. It was no longer a place of uncertainty. It was a place of completion. Because everything that needed to be understood had already been understood. Everything that needed to be prepared had already been prepared. The only thing left was timing. I stood up slowly, walked toward the window, and looked out at the street below. Cars moving. People passing. Life continuing exactly as it always does. Indifferent. Unaware. And for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to acknowledge the simplest truth of all. This was not about what she had done. That part was already finished. This was about what I was going to do next. And that was already set in motion. Because the moment I saw her at that gate, everything changed. Not for her. Not yet. But for me. And once that shift happens, once you move from not knowing to knowing, from reacting to deciding, there is only one direction left to go. Forward. Quietly. Precisely. Until the moment arrives when everything you built behind the scenes steps into the light. And when it does, there will be no confusion. No argument. No second version of the story. Just the truth. Exactly as it is.